This set of slides looks more specifically at text types. You might want to look at a helpful website to get a better idea of what text types in manuscripts are all about. But the text of the New Testament by Metzger and Ehrman is sufficient for you, and you don't need to go beyond that. Now, the general idea behind text types is the idea of genealogy, that there are similarities between different manuscripts in the population of manuscripts that can be grouped together because of those similarities. And so the assumption is that the similarities have behind them some kind of common source. We also can find the language of families as opposed to the larger category of text types. A family would be a group of a few manuscripts that seem to also that have at one point in scholarship been thought to have some family resemblances. Now, it's actually true that this understanding of textual criticism in terms of families has been overthrown. And so the reason you need to know about this is simply that if you see F1 or F13, for example, someone has suggested a family resemblance of manuscripts that fit into the category F1 or F13, and you'd have to find from your critical edition what manuscripts those are if you wanted to know more specifically. As I said, the family idea has kind of fallen apart, and so it's not going to help you in evaluating the manuscript evidence anymore. It's just a way of grouping several manuscripts together. Another word you need to know in textual criticism is the word recension. Imagine a number of different readings available at a given time in history, and someone wanting to rein in the diversity by producing a more authoritative manuscript copy. That would be what a recension is, and it would naturally involve conformity among subsequent copies in the actual readings in the text. Not just similar characteristics, but actual following of the rendition of certain words. We can talk about characteristics just in terms of what we can observe of how the scribes behaved in their copying. Were they more careful or not, for example? Did they tend to prefer a certain word or not? Did they tend to harmonize the Gospels so that when Jesus says something in Matthew, he says it similarly in Luke and Mark? Or did they not tend to harmonize? Over time, however, the copies from this hypothetical recension we're talking about here would begin to differ as scribal mistakes once again crept in, or intentional changes crept in to the later copies. A text type, then, could be due to there being, at one point in the history of the manuscripts, a recension. It would explain the characteristics that can be associated with a certain text type and the manuscripts in there. Semler, for example, thought that Origen produced a recension that stands within and behind the Alexandrian text type, and Lucian of Antioch produced a recension that stands within and behind what he called the Eastern text type, a term we're not going to continue to use. So you can see just from what has been said so far that there is theory now involved in discussing the manuscripts, and it's possible that a scholar was wrong in the way in which he grouped the manuscripts into a text type. The question arises, then, whether a text type will be due to there being a recension in the history of the copying of manuscripts. This is believed to be the case in two of our text types, the Alexandrian and the Byzantine. Somewhere along the line, scholars think a recension made differences to a group of manuscripts before and a group of manuscripts after. And one has to ask whether the recension corrected wild copying, for example, or whether the recension actually introduced new problems into the history of the text. Most textual critics believe that the Alexandrian recension stayed truer to the autographs, the original text of a New Testament writing as written by the author or authors. One also has to ask whether what some call a text type is really a type in the sense of giving consistent witness to a certain kind of reading, or whether the alleged type is nothing more than an approach to copying that certain copyists had at a given time in history or in a certain geographical region. The latter of these two possibilities is believed to be the case for the Western text type. More on that later. These points sound rather theoretical, no doubt, but they will be more understandable as we turn to discussion of the four text types to which scholars refer. Before we look at the text types in more detail, I'd like to say something about the value of text types for textual criticism. My first of 3 points is this. If various text types share the same reading, this strengthens the possibility that the reading is not idiosyncratic. That is, that it's just the reading of one manuscript, or maybe a few manuscripts that are somehow related to each other, but really not at a large scale, so that we are actually engaged with a real possibility of what an alternative reading might be. We want to rule out what's idiosyncratic. The scribe fell asleep halfway through the writing the word or something like that. That's not a real text type to consider, or a real reading to consider. It doesn't represent a text type at all. If, on the other hand, only one text type supports a given reading, then this raises doubt about its witness to the original reading. On the other hand, secondly, textual critics usually prefer the Alexandrian or Egyptian text type over other text types. If a reading lacks an Alexandrian witness, then this raises real questions about the strength of its witness to the original reading. Now, this point does rest on the idea that the Alexandrian or Egyptian text type is really one of the best kind of readings for texts. And so you should note that there is a minority view that disparages the Alexandrian or Egyptian text type and prefers another text type, the Byzantine text type. Behind this view seems to be the motivation to preserve cherished readings from days gone by, in my view. This is not the place to rehearse these issues, but I just want to note in all fairness that there is a debate in some circles about these things. Everybody I'm presenting to you with regard to textual criticism is going to agree that the Alexandrian text type is typically the preferred text type. Now, this doesn't mean ultimately that you always go with the Alexandrian reading, but it does weigh heavily into the larger discussion of what is the original reading. Thirdly, preference for the Alexandrian textual readings must not override other issues in text critical methodology then. An eclectic method of textual criticism, which we'll come back to discuss right at the end of this lecture, is going to take into consideration various pieces of evidence and not just the Alexandrian readings. Westcott and Hort tended to prefer a single manuscript of the Alexandrian type, Codex Vaticanus, but this is surely not a sufficient method for textual criticism, given all the evidence that we can consider. Now note, check a textbook on textual criticism like Metzger and Ehrman's The Text of the New Testament to see whether scholars consider the manuscript to be a certain text type or not. And remember that a single manuscript can vary from, say, for example, the Gospels to the Epistles of Paul as to whether its text type is Alexandrian or something else. It is possible, then, that a manuscript may represent one text type in part of the New Testament and another in another part of the New Testament. Alexandrinus represents the Byzantine text type in the Gospels, but the Alexandrian text type in the rest of the New Testament. Now I'll just give a little bit more detail about some of these text types. Again, you can turn to the Text of the New Testament textbook that you have for more on these text types. The Byzantine text type is noteworthy largely because some people give a lot of importance to it. It is indeed an early text type. The Syriac version of the New Testament, called the Peshitta, supports the Byzantine text type, and it was translated about the 4th century. The abbreviations for this text type are either a fancy M for majority, that is the majority of manuscripts since they are Byzantine, or simply BYZ for Byzantine. The Textus Receptus, or received text, is the manuscripts that Erasmus used for his 1516 critical edition of the Greek New Testament. He only had a few manuscripts, but he believed that he had the received text, and therefore the text that points to the original reading. For his work, though, he used Byzantine manuscripts available to him, with one exception, and so this Textus Receptus really represents the Byzantine text type. The Byzantine text type is the only other real text type, as we've noted, in terms of having a real recension and real characteristics that are not just sort of vague general ways of talking about a text type. Everything else lies between the Byzantine and the Alexandrian text types. The Byzantine text type is the type with the most manuscript evidence, as I've said, and most minuscules are Byzantine. This point is worth noting because as you move on in church history, more and more manuscripts can be found for a certain century. We'd love to have most of our manuscripts coming from the 2nd century, but in fact most of our manuscripts come from after the 8th century, the 9th century and following, and these are typically Byzantine. In the Middle Ages, then, this really was the accepted text type in the church. And it is the type that backs the Textus Receptus and therefore the King James Version. Now the Western text type can be related to the Latin Vulgate, just as the Byzantine text type can be related to the Syrian version. The Western text type can be related to the Latin Vulgate, which Jerome compiled early in the 5th century. In his preface to the Gospels, Jerome indicates a reticence to prepare a Latin recension, the Vulgate. He says several things about this. Firstly, Jerome is aware that there are about as many differences in the textual readings in his day as there are manuscripts. Apparently the Latin manuscripts are in view here. He primarily has the Latin manuscripts in mind then. Now the Western text is marked, as we've noted before, by wild copying, and this does indeed agree with what Jerome is saying. Secondly, Jerome is concerned about his work. He's concerned about this work of translating the Greek into Latin and of looking at the earlier Latin translations and trying to bring them together into one accepted translation. He's worried about that because he knows that he will be accused of changing readings that people are accustomed to find in their Bibles. You can compare that to the issue of people who just don't want anything other than the King James Bible because that's what they grew up with, that's what they learned, and that's what they want to stay with. And they don't like it if anybody's changing anything. They think that somebody is up to tricks and messing with their Bibles. Thirdly, Jerome understands his work, which was commissioned by the Pope, Pope Demetrius I, to be a matter of cleaning up the old Latin manuscripts based on the Greek. That he believes this is possible, although difficult, suggests that he believes that the wild copying in the Latin manuscripts can be corrected in the 5th century through a consultation with the Greek manuscripts. So apparently the Greek copying was not as wild as was the Latin. The Caesarean text type is really a tradition. It is the most mixed text type that we have, and not a real text type in any pure sense of the word. It's represented by some family of manuscripts, the family designated 1 and the family designated 13, and some other manuscripts as noted here, 565, 700, and Q. They do show some similarities, and so it was thought by the Lakes and Blakes, some scholars from years ago, that a new text type had been discovered because they saw a few similarities. But over time, these witnesses we've seen share only their disagreement with the Byzantine readings rather than some group of agreements that would render them a text type. Seldom do they agree in their readings. The research leading to this theory was almost all done in Mark's Gospel, moreover, but what was noticed was more of a Markan phenomenon for these manuscripts rather than something that had to do with the entire New Testament. According to textual critic Gordon Fee, the Caesarean tradition represents the popular text in the Church of the 3rd and 4th centuries. I've mentioned the fact that we have two real text types, the Byzantine and the Alexandrian, and that they're polar opposites, with every other kind of manuscript falling somewhere in between. So why not prefer the Byzantine text type over the Alexandrian? Well, Zane Hodges of Dallas Theological Seminary some years back did indeed prefer the Byzantine text type. He said, under normal circumstances, the older a text is than its rivals, the greater are its chances to survive in a plurality or a majority of the texts extant at any subsequent period. But the oldest text of all is the autograph. Thus it ought to be taken for granted that, barring some radical dislocation in the history of transmission, a majority of texts will be far more likely to represent correctly the character of the original than a small minority of texts. And so he's referring to the fact that you have these later manuscripts, but they form the majority of manuscripts that we have. You have some earlier manuscripts that are clearly in the minority and of the Alexandrian text type very often, not only so though. And so he says over time, as church history continues and you have more manuscripts that are Byzantine, so that it's the text type of the Middle Ages, you just have to accept that this is indeed best in the best indication of what the original read. Now, Michael Holmes responds to this, and he responds to the words that I have underlined on this slide in particular. So Michael Holmes says in an article on textual criticism the following in response to Zane Hodges. Normal circumstances, and barring some radical dislocation, Hodges' words, are the very points at issue. From the 7th century, Christianity in the Middle East, North Africa, and Asia Minor was gradually wiped out or greatly oppressed by Islam, the very regions where the church began and where scholarship first flourished. Moreover, one cannot treat 1400 years of Christian history as one episode in one geographical region, as Hodges does. Nor should one start at the end of this period and assume that the later documents, which are larger in number, should be privileged over the earlier ones, which are fewer in number. The Alexandrian is equally as old as the Byzantine text type. And this then leads us to one of the most important principles in textual criticism, and that is, don't count manuscripts to determine the worth of a text type. North Africa, as we said, succumbed to Islam, whereas the Byzantine world continued as a Christian empire. So North Africa ceased to produce many copies of the New Testament, whereas the Byzantine world, the eastern part of the Roman Empire, continued for a long time to copy Greek manuscripts. According to Gordon Fee, the Byzantine type was defined by a recension around probably AD 300. And we have no Byzantine manuscripts from Egypt. The character of Byzantine texts suggests alterations have been made to the text. Now, that kind of a point needs to be looked at by people who read a lot of these manuscripts. And since we're not coming anywhere close to that in this course, this is a point that you're asked to accept from scholars whose business it is to do textual criticism. By way of example, they would say that the Byzantine text type has smooth readings, good grammar, and is well written. The Alexandrian text type does not reveal systematic grammatical and stylistic polishing that was given to the other manuscripts, the other texts, including the later form of the Alexandrian text itself. The Byzantine text type, moreover, conflates Western and Alexandrian readings at times. For example, in Mark 9:49. And finally, the Byzantine text type tends to harmonize. If there's something said similarly in, say, the Synoptic Gospels, there might be a tendency to harmonize, whereas that won't be found in the Alexandrian. It's reasons like this that have led scholars to prefer the Alexandrian to the more numerous Byzantine text type. So far, I've been talking about text types. There is another way to talk about the same thing, and that is to refer to this as categories. This doesn't assume that you can actually talk about a specific kind of text, and doesn't assume ideas about recensions and so forth. It just says, let's just call this group of manuscripts Category 1, Category 2, Category 3, Category 4, and Category 5. But now, having gone through this discussion of text types, you can see what the different nomenclature now refers to. So, Category 1 has a high proportion of the early text, and it includes all manuscripts up to the beginning of the 4th century. For example, Papyri 75, 45, Vaticanus, and Sinaiticus. Category 2 has a considerable proportion of the early text, but with some alien influences, some smoothing out of the readings, some improvements to the readings, some Byzantine influence. And so the Egyptian text type in L and Theta fit into Category 2. Category 3 has a small but negligible proportion of readings and many polished readings that are Byzantine and other sources. Category 4 is the Western text type represented by manuscript D. And then Category 5 is predominantly the Byzantine text in the manuscripts that represent it. So here we have then a different way of categorizing these things. You can follow either method depending on what kind of resource you're using. If you were following the Alon's book, the text of the New Testament, then you might talk in terms of the categories. Now the latest edition of Metzger and Ehrman is using the language of categories as well. Category 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. As I've been presenting the method for textual criticism, I've suggested now and then that there's some debate in scholarship. Scholars do use different methods for textual criticism. It is true that what I've presented and what you find in Metzger and Ehrman is the typical understanding of how to do textual criticism. But remember that there are theories involved in this, and it's an ongoing science. So you need to be open to the fact that there might be a different way of looking at the evidence. What has been presented then in this lecture is somewhat of a consensus view on text critical method, and it does indeed prefer the Alexandrian text type. There are, as I've noted, though, some detractors, particularly around the Byzantine text type. A minority that needs to be noted. So note that there is a debate on text criticism method out there. First, there is one approach that might be called the historical documentary method of doing textual criticism. It emphasizes the external criteria and not the internal criteria, which we have yet to talk about. It organizes extant manuscripts into groups of clusters of similar text types, as we've talked about in this lecture. It identifies which of these clusters represent the earliest text tradition. So, for example, Westcott Hort said that knowledge of documents should precede final judgment upon readings. They are saying we need to understand what the external texts have read and give preference to an understanding of those manuscripts per se. Now, over against that, there is the rigorous eclectic method of textual criticism. This emphasizes the internal criteria. It says choose the reading that makes the best sense. Don't worry so much about figuring out the external evidence. Wouldn't it be nice if it were so simple? But this does not seem to me to have any kind of scholarly rigor to it at all. It is especially associated with George Kilpatrick and J. Keith Elliott. They said a knowledge of an author's usage should precede the final judgment. That's true, but that's not the only thing to consider. The reasoned eclectic method is the method that I've been teaching you. It's the method used by the UBS 4 and the Nestle Aland 27th, 28th editions, and earlier for that matter. It's the typical approach of New Testament scholarship. The reasoned eclectic method combines methods 1 and 2. That is, it wants to look at the external evidence and the internal evidence and evaluate that on a case-by-case basis as to what the likely reading is. Finally, the majority text method I've already mentioned. It's the method that says that the majority of manuscripts really represent what the original was. It assumes then a connection between the majority of manuscripts and the autographs.